Text of Jude, and around verse 8 is where we're going to be beginning this morning. It's Jude and verse 8. Before we go any further and we open up our hearts and minds in study, let's bow our hearts before our Maker and our King. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that are found in Christ. We thank you for this time we share together in study. Help us as students to be attentive to the message of the text. Help us as learners and disciples to take our knowledge of your will and move our understanding to match your expectations for us. Help us to be aware of our own weaknesses so that we can be strengthened by our brethren and know that their support is there for us. In all things, we offer ourselves to you as a sacrifice, and we hope it is to your glory. And we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so as we've talked about a couple of times, the text of Jude is concise, brief, short, however you want to think about it, but it is very rich or dense. How many of you have made fudge before? Right, raise your hand. Then we add a second question. How many of you have successfully made fudge before? That's the same number. Good, because I'm not in that crowd. I have attempted to make fudge, but it was an unsuccessful attempt, and I determined that my outcome was smarter to go to the store. See's Candy sells fudge. It's very good. Go to other people's houses to sell it. Because there's a lot of process involved, a lot of time, and you have to let stuff sit in the various stages to finally get to this outcome. And then if you make one small mistake, the batch is no longer fudge. It's a mess. Sometimes a tasty mess, but a mess nonetheless. And what happens in that process, all the chemical processes that baking is, because baking is rocket science. If you didn't know that, you now know that. They're exactly the same thing. You're taking a series of ingredients under high temperature and pressure, and you're carefully calculating the outcome. So rocket science, baking, same thing. But there's a lot of stuff that goes in there, and as it matures, the process goes on, there's a high level of density at the end thing. There's a lot going on there. Jude is much the same way. The text of Jude can be viewed as rocket science, as baking, or in this case, our outcome, which is a nice, sweet fudge, where it's all dense and solid and rich and full of good ideas, but you've got to be careful to make sure that your understanding of it is precise and careful. Anything out of order, and then you might have something that tastes good, but it won't be what you need or what you want, and it very well could be very harmful to you. And so as we pay attention to some of these more complicated parts of Jude's teaching, and they become complicated because we don't know with the level of certainty about some of these illustrations, metaphors, or histories that Jude is pulling in, that we do other things. That means we have to turn our, and I'll say speculation, but I'm not talking about it in a negative way, our speculation down a little bit. Because a lot of what we do when we're trying to understand or interpret the Bible is we're making these connections on assumptions. We assume that this is the event that the author is talking about. Or we assume that this is the class of beings or people or the place. And so we have to be very careful now when our ability to create these threads gets smaller and smaller. There's a lot of stuff we do not know with a high level of certainty. So that's where careful research, careful study, and faith begin to become more easily identified as a key component in our recipe. So in this section, we've got about 5 verses of primary first text and then another 2 verses or so to put the last chunk around to verse 16. There are a series of kind of almost illustrations that are part of this dialogue that have to be set kind of in a sequence to see how they unfurl. So let's start first by reading together verses 8 through 13 We'll read 14, 15, and 16 a little bit later in class. And then we'll break down some of these sections. So let's start with our reading. And Bobby, could you read for us verses 8 through 13 of Jude, please?
Likewise also these, fear the dream was defile the flesh, despise the man, and speak evil of dignities. Yet might of the archangel when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, does not bring against him a railing accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke thee. But these speak evil of those things which they know not, but what they know naturally as brute beasts, and those things they corrupt themselves. Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the heir of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Korah. Verse 12.
Yeah, read through verse 13, so 12 and 13 as well.
These are spots in their feast of charity, when they feast with you, feeding themselves without fear. Clouds they are without water, carried about with the wind. Trees whose fruit withers. Our fruit twice dead, plucked up by the roots, raging waves of the sea, foaming out their own shame, wandering stars, to whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever.
All right, so let's think about this for a second. It begins with verses 8, 9, and 10, laying out what could be considered, to a degree, the usual suspects. These are common illustrations in the writing of Israel as rebellious minds, ideas, or practices. And so those usual suspects then have us quickly knowing kind of what's going on. Like, hey, this is that. These individuals, their behavior is similar, but some of them are new introductions to us. It's like, hey, wait a minute. I know some of this, but then some of this, when it starts talking about angelic beings in the text of Jude, I've got to be careful, again, to make sure that I'm connecting them in the right ways. So let's start with verse 8 and its small inclusio. It says, yet in like manner, these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme, as the ESV says, the glorious ones. So, in your quick mental survey, how many texts can you think about that refer to dreamers in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, Genesis to Malachi, plus the preaching of John? What was that? Joseph is a key one that comes up, and that's an interesting one because of a lot of complication as to what's going on with those dreams, right? Some of the dreams take place early in his life, some at the later stages of his life, and he's doing something that will become an unsanctioned behavior at the time, because he is marrying outside of his larger family unit. And so, and he's doing so in a way that hides his identity. By the time his brothers return to his presence, can they identify Joseph? No, there's a number of things that are obvious possibilities to that are a part of it. Obviously, on a personal level, we go, well, clearly as you age, you look different. And so that's certainly part of it. But the text actually says there's more, right? That his clothing and his attire, his manner of makeup and all the things that would go on with that conceal his cultural and physiological appearance. And so he no longer looks like a Jew, nor does he look, we say Jew now, but as part of that family unit, an Israelite's larger perspective.
And his speech was changed.
And his speech was changed. And so that level of hiddenness kind of hides that aspect there. But here's the interesting thing. The way this text is read here, on the strength of their dreams, and I think the RSV, these ungodly people pollute their own bodies. The ESV had defile their flesh. There's a second century, first century, right on the edge of like a 190 to 200 range of time frame, text entitled The Shepherd of Hermes. And that text actually says that this phrase, then, should be understood to think in terms of adultery. And so what Jude is saying, likely, is that you have those who engaged in some kind of adulterous behavior. Remember, adultery, as used in the Old Testament and the New Testament, covered at least two areas. It would cover sexual adultery, but it also could include spiritual adultery, that you had forsaken God. And it kind of gets used that way in the New Testament too. But you have this group that say they're listening to these dreams, and they are adulterers of some kind. Now, in specific, Deuteronomy 13 and verses 1 through 5 identifies why dreamers are bad. Because it says, in essence, in Deuteronomy 13, those who are dreamers will lead people away from God. They will be the ones who create the fissures in that relationship. They create that conflict. And so our mind, when I see dreamers like Michael, I go to Joseph, but Joseph's role is weird because he's actually booted out of the family, but he's actually booted out ahead of the family, is the way to think about it. And it's not a pleasant experience. He's not loved by his brothers much at all. His entire experience up until he gets into the court of Pharaoh is pretty awful. And it's his brother that starts the reconciliation there at the end of it. So Joseph isn't our great model. The only other one we have is this Deuteronomy model that says, hey, dreamers, they lead you away from God. Does that fit the context of Jude then? That Deuteronomy 13 picture of these dreamers? And so I would suggest to you that this adultery under review should be viewed with those two forks of ideas. Fork number one, certainly in the first century, sexual immorality like this in religious context, super common. But also I would think it would have the implied meaning that, hey, these people are leading you away from God. And it's that kind of defilement that is of most importance to Jude's audience. And that same text in Deuteronomy 13 has the outcome of inciting rebellion too. And so I think it's a great textual tie-in. If you don't keep notes in your Bible, don't worry about it. But if you do, you might put Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 5, right next to this 8th verse of the text of Jude. And the last clause there, this phrase that is heap abuse on celestial beings in some translations, or let me double check the ESV here, blaspheme the glorious ones. It's the same, it's a second charge attached to this idea of rejecting authority. That they're pushing back at whatever the standard would be. What are your thoughts there? I've given my long dialogue as to what I think is the best connection there, but I'm curious as to see what each of you may have come up with. Les, did you have something you were thinking earlier?
I was kind of wondering if, it's not something that I expect we can find out right now. I was just kind of wondering if maybe there was a little bit of difference in Greek when dreams are used like this than there are when God spoke to people in dreams, if there's anything different about the particular, the word or anything, because they seem to have kind of different outcomes or different purposes God actually used dreams to speak to prophets and people. And then these dreams here, to me, these dreams are like people kind of just thinking way off how they want things to be or wish things to be or try to make things be. I just didn't know if maybe there's a different word for some of it in some context.
My initial answer is I don't think so, but I don't know so. And the reason I say I don't think so is that most of this is cued by context, especially if you're talking about the Old Testament texts. In that case, I can definitively say that because of the limited number of words in the word bank, the answer is almost always they used one word for it and then they contextually modified it to mean something else. And so if you see a word that says dreams, it either is the only word that says dreams or there are other things that need to be interpreted to have that word mean dreams. Old Testament Hebrew then gets translated into Greek, and so a word is selected that kind of means a thing. In this case, though, I'm also kind of pretty sure from my pre-reading for class that the answer is I don't think so. Because if you've, and this is the way you can check it without having to have Greek or Hebrew reading. Think about the way in which the English translations, our English Bibles, introduce the various conversations that God has with people. There's a grammatical introduction of God spoke or God came to me in the dream, etc. That in context, we're given a clue that says this is different than that. In those same stories, when the false prophets are brought up, Elohim is not now mentioned, or God, or the Lord. There's 3 or 4 Old Testament words and 5 or 6 New Testament words that would be titles or designations for the Father that aren't used. And so in the language of the English, we can almost always sort it out that this is context cluing it. What's interesting, though, is the one thing we already mentioned with Joseph. That's the most obscure of them all. Joseph's dreams in the text are rarely internally attributed to God. They are interpreted to be from God. Like they don't have God saying, it says, Joseph later on says, I understood these things. Early on, it was God. In the middle of Joseph's life, it was me, Joseph speaking first person. And in the end, he acknowledges that God moved things along. And so there's some things, interesting things going on there. What else? Things that you noticed. We're just in verses 8, 9, and 10 right now, although 8 in particular is where we've focused. Bobby?
Didn't God call Samuel the same way in a dream?
Yeah, there's at least 3 or 4 prophets that have dream introductions. Samuel would be one. Isaiah's introduction is written and presented to us as a dream-like introduction. And so there's a lot of that there. And then some of the minor prophets, or the 12, also have dream-like introductions. The interactions that God has with some of the patriarchs seem to have that same perspective. And then the imagery context of John's text of Revelation also has that after the letters segment that takes place. It's more dialogue. Let's talk about verse 9 at this point. Okay, we'll shift forward in what we've got going on here in the 9th verse, and that's, but when, this is contrast, the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Moses. He did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, the Lord rebuke you. That's an interesting sentence to me, just independent of everything, but I'm curious, when you read that verse today, yesterday, in preparation for the class over the course of the week or whatever, how do you think through that conversation? What are some of the things that come to mind? Michael?
It seems odd that it would be wrong to rebuke the devil. It makes me think, okay, when I say something about somebody, maybe I'm way out of line too.
Yeah, there's like, you've got a spiritual being otherworldly creature, an angel of a different type of existence. And that's one of the ways that I think is a good way to describe the difference between humanity and angelic beings, is a different type of existence. Being told, no, you can't do that. You can't condemn, bring judgment upon. And so one of the things I noticed was, hey, maybe there's something different in the type of judgment being discussed here. And there's this sense of righteous judgment that's being identified there. Because think about this. Who makes the final judgment towards the devil?
God.
Yeah, I think there's something underneath this that we got to pay attention to that says, hey, what's going on here is that's already been that's not your job. You're whittling on the wrong end of the stick, because God, as God, and that's Father, Son, and Spirit, have a plan for that awful part of things. By the way, this is a great time to recognize something that's really important in how we treat the passing of living beings. When someone dies, do you or I have any concrete ability to determine their spiritual outcome? We can intellectually acknowledge that. So that means that not only can we not preach someone into heaven, we also cannot preach them into condemnation either. I don't have a clue of what happens in determining the individual judgment of any soul. It's not my end of the stick. And I think if there is a Bible passage that would be at least in the same basket that I would need to think about, it's this one. If they couldn't do that, I shouldn't do this. I think it's probably the best application in that little narrow field that I can come with, because that's a common question. Hey, what happened to so-and-so? Now, it's often, this is the way to think about it, it's often the really awful people that we bring up. Oh, what about Hitler? What's his outcome? Because we think that's an easy question. Let's turn the tables. Think about the most righteous person you know. Just like absolute. And is Moses on your list? What about Moses? It's the same thing. There's two ends of the equation here. And we all want to say Moses is good, right? Because we have an intertextual example of him still being in God's presence post his past his death. So we're good with that check mark. But still, they're disputing about his body at this point. So in context, you got some stuff going on that there's unresolved aspects of it. So I think it's just really wise for us to recognize that we have a limited room to operate. Got a small little window of things that are actually our things. And here's a neat principle that's worked well for me. The better I am at letting that go, the better I am. Doesn't mean it's easy to let some of those concerns, worries, or issues go, but the better I get at letting them go, the better individually I am. Because I'm not weighed or hooked down by it. I'm not overburdened by it. I think there's something to be gained there, independent from us trying to determine exactly what might be going on in the actual event itself. Is that little point there? Michael, did you have something else? Oh. Bobby, did you have something? Okay.
Moses, if we look at things from our little understanding, Moses didn't get a chance to go into the promised land. He saw it.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't get a chance to go there.
Yeah. Look, he didn't get in. So clearly he didn't get in. Like, we have a weird way of kind of breaking things down sometimes. And our perspective is very short-centered. We got to remember that God's perspective is universal. Like he's got all the pieces to the puzzle laid out, and he knows a far bit more than any of us do. That's why there's some good value in that practice to this kind of like, this is God's space. Now, in context of like what's going on there, note that this particular incident here in verse 10 is not one that is heavily detailed. when we go to the end of the class and we have, what do I have questions about? By the way, this is one of the things. Like, I don't know what's going on with what the issue is. Because, and the reason I say that, here's this. One, according to the teaching that's clear and explicit regarding what Christ has taught, what happens to all bodies when Christ returns to judge the earth? They're changed, they rise, they meet together in the air. Is there any exclusion to bodies in the sense of being resurrected? Is only some folks going to be resurrected, or is the language say everybody? So, from my human standpoint, who cares about the body, right? So, clearly I don't have enough information to even begin to determine what they're fussing about, right? Like, I don't know is a powerful term. In this case, it's the right answer. Like, I don't know what's going on there. I do know that there are exceptions to my predefined rule. Are there any Bible personages who seem to have escaped death? Elijah. What about anybody well before that? Enoch, right? Also, do you have something else? Yeah. You know, we've got some aspects in the text, but there are individuals that seem to not experience death. They're taken by God in different contexts. But I had a rule, right? And my rule was everyone gets resurrected. Except God made the rules. And I kind of like to think that the exception proves the fact that there is a rule. When God has an extraordinary part of instruction that says this thing happened, and it's not the normal way of doing things. By the way, that's what we call a miracle, if you want to think about it a different way. So all of these other exceptions then are clearly in the realms of what we would consider miraculous activity.
This question is probably, if they didn't die, did the people that were alive know where these people have gone?
Text is, we don't know. I know in the case of Enoch, there's so little written that I can conclusively say nobody said anything. Now, here's the neat thing. Just like you and I, how many of you have ever heard the phrase, let's see, one of the terms is the Mishnah. These are the writings of Jewish rabbis that go all the way up to around 200 or so AD as a block. And they talk about how they deal with these things in the text. They're obviously focused on the Old Testament. And if you read through them, this is what you're going to find. Questions about things like this. And they will come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ways that they think this could be reconciled. And they actually have instances about what happens to Enoch. And they're trying to do what we do. Take two Bible passages that don't have enough in between them and figure out what happened in the middle. I mention that because it's really important to know this. If someone ever comes to you and says, well, I read this Jewish rabbi from the 3rd century BC and he says this, you can then immediately know this to be true. In that same very book, there are 3 or 4 other rabbis who have wildly different opinions than that guy. It doesn't mean the information is useless. It is not definitive. And I say that kind of as a cool way to introduce the reality that, hey, that's like a good information, but it's also what we do. We try to figure this stuff out. And then we say, okay, but realize this is me just making an assumption, a little bit of speculative connections, and we hope it's the accurate inferences or pieces to understand what's going on. It's not new. And I'm sure if we went back another 1,000 years before the writing of those Jewish rabbis, we'd find notes back and forth in Bible class as they're sitting in the synagogues or in the homes and they're worshiping and saying, hey, what do you think Enoch is doing? You know, because that's what we do. It's human behavior. And then in verse 11, they make these theological jumps. So we have these two classes of rebels. rebels who are dreamers, who sever people from God, rebels who are fighting against God's plan. The angels, they, no, you can't do that. You're fighting against God's plan, and they are linked to the way of Cain. And then Balaam's error. And then Korah's rebellion. Do you notice any threads in those three stories? Anything that might be similar? Is it just as simple as they didn't do what they were told, or is there a little bit more going on? What was Balaam's problem? We'll go in the middle of our tent pole. So he wanted to get something for himself out of it. What all was going on with Cain? In the dialogue that takes place in regards to the unacceptable nature of his sacrifice, what is the tone that you infer from his attitude? If you just read that, he's frustrated, his anger is like, why is mine not good enough? Am I not? How come he gets it all? I brought you a sacrifice. There's pride. There's sense of, what do I get from it? And Balaam also has a little bit of that. What do I get from it? Oh, and by the way, Korah's rebellion, it's all about what do I get for it. Now think back to our broader teachings of 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude and the behavior of false prophets as to their outcomes. What did they want? Did they want people to come to God? Was that what the false prophets and the false teachers wanted? They seem to be wanting them to come somewhere else. Come to their pocket. Now that might be money, could be power, could be prestige. But they wanted the people under their sway, their control. They became, verse 12, blemishes within the boundaries of what is a unique Greek word, love feasts. And I mentioned this last week in class, and I'll kind of bring it up again. Jude does something here that predominantly, I think, only one other New Testament writer does. He kind of makes up words. Not exactly, but kind of. Paul uses words together that we don't find in a large chunk of other first century writings. Let me ask this question. In your family, are there any made-up words that kind of stick around? Like your family seems to have made up a word and it became a family slang word? Yeah, we all kind of have things that just kind of attach themselves, and they're not necessarily being used as the word normally was intended to be used. My mom did that all the time growing up. She would forget what a thing was called, and she'd just make up a word for it. Slap the letters together, and some of those just stuck. Stuck, that was one of them. But they just lingered. They stayed there. Well, Paul does that with the word that we find as homosexual in our translations. That's one of the words that really wasn't a common word in the first century, and Paul just slapped two words together to make one word. Well, this word here for love feast is also kind of that way. It's not the common use of the term. There are other terms that use this. So that helps us understand, hey, maybe there's something special or unique about this. And I have a view of the word that has a wide usage, but there's also a narrow usage. The wide usage is, this is the relationships under play. Their agape love is now being infected by these hidden reefs within them. And agape love is a Greek word agape, is a kind of love. In this case, these love faiths are agapeis, is the word that's used there, which is now read to mean love feasts. The other more narrow use is some people will say that this is a connection to the supper, the Lord's Supper. That's also a fine way to understand it. I'm over on this end of this uncommon word. You can be on the other end of it because there's good ways to think about it that way. But I want you to consider something for a moment, using either perspective of the word. How is it that someone who is self-absorbed, self-focused, personal, gotta be big, gotta be great, going to infect a local group of believers? How does that eventually manifest itself?
It's persuasive.
Some persuasion might go on.
Who might take on someone's personality.
Eventually, you kind of pick up habits, right?
Well, verse 11, it talks about them reacting as animals would. They don't understand something, they just react.
Mm-hmm.
So I would imagine that whatever's going on, they're reacting as the way they would react because they don't really know.
Right.
Some people have a way of speaking, and you can maybe know that they are not telling the truth, but when they speak, you want to believe them.
That there is a charisma that some folks have developed, or maybe by their personality or their look, that we go, I'll trust that guy. I kind of think of it as the Sauline approach. Saul looked like a king. And so you look at him and you go, well, clearly, I should follow a king like that. David is not presented to us as looking like a king when we meet him. He's a shepherd boy. Why do I want to follow a shepherd boy when I've got a big, glorious king? And so there's some of that too. But I'm going to illustrate it in a very painful way for me, but maybe not so much for you. For those of you who have been here at Eastside the entire time I've been preaching, has the amount of tacos in your life increased or decreased? Are you more aware of tacos than you used to be? It's like you guys are laughing because you know it's true, right? There has been a marked increase in taco consumption. I should get some advertising fees from the local industries. No, it's because that's how it works. The things that are important to a person make it into their speech, into their dialogue. And if you've got someone who is sneaky about it, then they become this last illustration of a hidden love feast, hidden reef within the love feast. Here's another way to think about it. When's the last time you got up in the middle of the night and you got upset because somebody moved something in the house without telling you, and you found out about it because you ran into it? And then you realize that no, it's always been there. It was just hidden because you're sleepy and dumb. Even though emotionally you believe that someone moved it. It get jumped out. Even though that, in my case, the little chest had been there the entire time since we've been in the house. But look, that's a hidden reef, right? Now, it's actually happened to me on the water, but I think most of us are more able to connect with this idea of it just appearing. Where'd that come from? Especially as your foot is bleeding out. It wasn't, but that's the picture here. You've got someone who has vile outcomes because of the nature of what they're saying or doing. And they hide it, intent or otherwise, in the place where you think you're going to get fed. This is the good food. And it ends up destroying you. That's a common challenge for humanity, a common challenge for religious communities. In this case, it's highly specific that amongst the kingdom of God, it has to be rooted out because of the kind of damage it will do. And it's a generational harm that can take place. Because if it's left, it rises. It will eventually absorb itself into the entire community if nothing is done about it. There's some substantial power to ideas that are referenced there. The way to think about it then is also given by a series of illustrations. Not just the hidden reefs one, but then shepherds who only feed themselves. What kind of shepherd is that? Selfish one, right? You think about that in the big picture of things, in the way in which And here's the illustration. The picture of an Israelite king is always a shepherd. Like, if you go to any of the tombs of the pharaohs, it's all farmers. But if you go to anywhere in Israel, all of their icons, even to this day, are shepherds. And all the bad kings of Israel, they fed themselves. The very few that would be identified as good kings, they actually made sure the community was enriched, more so than themselves. Or clouds without rain. Did you guys get woken up by the storm last night? I did. It gave me a little wake-up call, a little early arrival. Shook the whole house. We live in a fairly water-rich environment. Has Georgia ever had, in the recent history, like your lifetimes, a drought? Okay, so you guys, I don't remember that because I wasn't here for it, but it's had to have been maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It's rare. I grew up on the western part of the U.S. You know what we have? Droughts. I can think and recall 5 of them over the course of my first 20 years of life. And if you're driving up into Yosemite during a drought, oh, you know, because there's 2 things that happen. 1, everything's dead, and what's not dead is burnt, because that's when the fires take over. And large swaths of the national forests just got to burn. There's nothing they can do about it. It's so big, so massive, the wind's blowing around. Israel's topography, geography, geology is very similar to the western section of the United States on that outer edge of the Sierras. Very similar. And so it's a very rain-dependent culture. The wadis that run into the Central Valley are incredibly important to their agriculture. And so if someone said clouds without rain, oh, that's the worst of the tricksters. That's like opening up a gift that someone got you, and inside the gift is just dust. Because that can't help me. Where's the food? Where's the care and the compassion? I think there's something then for us to catch when this image is being used, because then it goes one more to autumn leaves without fruit and then pulled up. 2 types of dead. They were dead, and now they're dead. Kind of catches back to some of the miracles of Jesus, but it also fits the culture and community that Jude was writing within. That was still dependent upon the same kind of agricultural structure. And then, and this is the tie-in for us one more time, of which Trey has already alluded to the reading for it in this case. So Trey, could you read verses 14, 15, and 16 for us in our 1.5 minutes that we have left for class?
Now Enoch, the 7th Adam, prophesied about these men, also saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his saints, to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are grumblers, complainers, walking according to their own lusts, and they mouth great swelling words, flattering people to gain advantage.
So a couple of quick interesting things. This is maybe the second or third quotation in the New Testament text that comes from religious literature of the first century that we do not consider inspired. So this is a citation here from a book that's entitled First Enoch, and it's attributed to an Enoch that we think they consider to be the Enoch. But it's not one that we would look at and say the entirety of the book is inspired text for lots of good reasons. But it was around at the time of Jude. It was extant text, and it was what he quoted. It's exactly there. But we think about what's going on there. He cites Enoch, and there's a 3 repetition, if you will, of ungodly behavior, action in the text itself. And it really does quantify our same concerns. What's the deal with false teachers? What's the big outcome? What are they doing? What's the motivation? I would suggest that this quotation from 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9, really is just designed to help us get that idea. And he was using language that was familiar to him. And also that means that our time is up too, so we can't talk much more about it. But maybe next Sunday morning we can start there and continue. Thanks, everybody.